Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now.
When things go wrong in your life, and I mean really wrong, right? Not just spilling coffee on your shoe, but losing a job, going through a brutal breakup, or failing at something you just poured your absolute heart and soul into, what is the very first story you tell yourself?
Right, it's such a fundamental question, and it's one that most of us don't really stop to ask, mostly because those internal narratives feel entirely automatic, like they just happen to us.
Exactly. I mean, we usually think of optimism and pessimism as personality quirks. Like you're either born a glass half full person, or you're the person wondering, who left the glass out, why it's dirty, and who's going to have to wash it.
Right, yeah. It's the stuff of slogans on coffee mugs and those cheesy inspirational posters.
Yeah, totally. But today's deep dive reveals that this divide is not just some attitude. It is actually a matter of hard science, biological survival, and the fundamental psychological architecture of your mind.
It really is, and that distinction is just so crucial. The debate between optimism and pessimism isn't just some philosophical dinner party topic, or a matter of personal branding.
No, not at all.
It is an empirically measurable, scientifically tractable question. We are talking about the exact psychological mechanisms of how you anticipate the future and how you explain the past.
And how those specific cognitive mechanisms actually dictate everything from your cellular immune response to your overall lifespan, which is wild.
It is. It really is.
Which is why our mission today is to completely dismantle the self-help industry's uncritical cheerleading for positive thinking. You know the exact kind we're talking about, right?
Oh, definitely. The people on your feed telling you to just smile through it.
Right, or manifest good vibes, or suppress any negative thought because it'll somehow bring bad energy. Together, we're going to map out exactly how we process setbacks.
We really are. We're going to uncover why forcing some people to think positively actually destroys their performance. And we'll discover the incredibly counterintuitive survival strategy of a Vietnam prisoner of war.
Yeah, we have a massive stack of foundational research today. Longitudinal studies, hard biological data. So, to set the stage for you listening right now, optimism and pessimism are measurable traits.
Absolutely.
But to understand the light and why optimism actually works when it's applied correctly, we have to start in the absolute dark.
We do. To truly grasp the mechanics of optimism, we first have to look at its darkest, most paralyzing opposite.
Right.
We have to rewind to the late 1960s. So this was a time when the field of psychology was dominated by behaviorism.
Okay, and just to clarify, behaviorism is this idea that animals and humans only really learn through direct physical rewards and punishments, right?
Exactly. It was all about inputs and outputs. But into this landscape step two researchers, Martin Seligman and Stephen Mayer, with some foundational and honestly somewhat intense research.
Yeah.
This is the discovery of what is now known universally as learned helplessness.
And a quick heads up to you listening. This involves some animal studies from the 60s that are, well, they're a bit tough to hear about. But they absolutely shattered the existing paradigms and changed the course of psychology forever.
That's right. So Seligman and Mayer were working with animals, specifically dogs, and exposing them to inescapable electric shocks.
Yeah.
The animals were placed in a harness in a situation where they did no movement, no barking, no specific behavior could stop the discomfort. They were entirely at the mercy of their environment.
So they were totally trapped. The shocks were unpredictable and just completely out of their control.
Right, which is obviously distressing. But it's what happens in the second phase of the experiment that just blew the doors off the psychological establishment, because what they found completely defied what behaviorism predicted.
Precisely, because behaviorism basically stated that an animal would always try to escape pain if given the opportunity, right?
Exactly. So later, these same animals were placed in a different enclosure. It was a shuttle box.
A shuttle box?
Yeah, a box divided by a small, low barrier. In this new environment, escaping the shock was incredibly easy. The shock would happen on one side, and all the animal had to do was step over that low barrier to get to the safe side.
Which seems super simple.
It was. But the animals that had previously experienced the inescapable shocks didn't even try. They didn't run around looking for a way out.
Wow.
They just lay down, whimpered, and passively accepted the shock, even though the escape route was literally right there in front of them.
The researchers must have been completely stunned. Because, the animals hadn't been conditioned to lie down. They hadn't been punished for moving.
No, not at all.
But the takeaway wasn't just physical exhaustion or terror, right? They realized this passivity was something much more profound.
It was. It wasn't that the animals were too terrified to move. It was a learned cognitive state. They had internalized a concept.
And that is the pivotal insight.
Right. The animal had generalized the uncontrollability of that first inescapable situation to all new situations. They had effectively learned an abstraction. They learned, nothing I do matters.
Yeah. And they applied that overarching lesson even when the rules of the physical game had completely changed. They had learned to be helpless.
Exactly.
It's like playing a video game where the controller gets unplugged. If you're mashing the buttons to jump or dodge and absolutely nothing happens on the screen for long enough, you don't keep mashing the buttons forever.
Right. You just give up.
You eventually just set the controller down. And the real tragedy of this mental state is that even if someone walks into the room and plugs the controller back in, you don't pick it back up.
Because you've already internalized the core belief that the buttons don't work.
Exactly. You believe the system itself is fundamentally broken, so any future effort is just a waste of energy.
I love that. The unplugged controller is a brilliant way to conceptualize this because it perfectly translates to human psychology. This phenomenon became the foundational model for human depression.
Wow. So how did they make that leap from the dogs to humans?
Well, the theory proposed that a depressed person has experienced uncontrollable negative events in their life. Maybe an abusive childhood, a string of terrible jobs, or a chronic illness.
Right. Real situations where they lacked control.
Exactly. And from those genuine experiences of lack of control, they have learned that their actions have no effect on their outcomes. And crucially, they mistakenly apply that belief to new, completely different situations where they actually could make a difference.
They assume the controller is still unplugged, even when they are playing a totally different game.
Precisely. And this realization birthed one of the most productive, massive research programs in the history of clinical psychology because it forced researchers to ask a completely new question.
Who is what?
Why do some people who experience uncontrollable bad events develop learned helplessness, while others experience the exact same trauma and bounce back?
Right, because not everyone gives up.
Exactly. What is the psychological immune system that protects you from this virus of helplessness? That specific question led directly to what we now call the explanatory style model.
Okay, the explanatory style model.
Yes. And that dictates both your vulnerability to helplessness and your resilience in the face of immense adversity.
So let's get into the mechanics of this immune system. If learned helplessness is the virus, explanatory style is how our brains either fight it off or succumb to it.
That's right.
How exactly do our minds process a setback? The research breaks this down into 3 specific dimensions, doesn't it?
It does. It's essentially the architecture of your mind's excuse factory. And this is where you, listening, can really start applying this to your own life right now.
Okay, let's break them down. The first dimension is permanence.
Yeah. Yes, permanence. This is fundamentally about how you perceive time in relation to a failure. When something bad happens, do you view the underlying cause of that event as permanent, or do you view it as temporary?
Let's ground this in a real-world scenario. Let's say you bomb a major presentation at work in front of senior leadership.
Okay, perfect example. So the pessimistic explanatory style attributes this failure to a permanent, unchangeable, stable cause.
So their internal monologue is something like, I am terrible at public speaking. I always freeze up under pressure. I will never get this right.
Exactly. Notice the vocabulary there. Always, never. The cause stretches infinitely forward into the future.
But the optimistic explanatory style looks at the exact same bombed presentation, the exact same embarrassed feeling in the room, and attributes it to a temporary, highly unstable cause, right?
Yes. The internal monologue is more like, I bombed that presentation because I didn't sleep well last night, the projector kept glitching, which threw off my rhythm, and we were totally rushed on this specific project.
Right. It's isolated in time. It doesn't mean tomorrow's presentation will be bad. The cause basically has a strict expiration date.
Which brings us to the second dimension, which is pervasiveness.
Okay, permanence is about time. So what is pervasiveness?
If permanence is about time, pervasiveness is about space, or the scope of the event. Is the cause of the failure global or is it specific to one domain?
Okay, returning to our executive who just ruined the presentation.
Right. The pessimistic style generalizes that specific failure to a global, all-encompassing incapacity.
So they're thinking, I am totally incompetent, I'm a terrible employee.
Exactly. Honestly, my whole career is a joke, and I can't do anything right. The failure bleeds out of the boardroom and infects every other area of their life and self-worth.
It's basically a contagion.
Yes. But the optimistic style keeps the failure quarantined. It limits the blast radius. It's specific.
Like, I struggled with this particular topic because I'm not a deep expert on Q3 international tax law.
Exactly. It doesn't mean they are a bad employee. It just means they are bad at this one highly specific thing. They can still go back to their desk and be great at the rest of their job.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
And then we reach the final and perhaps most complex dimension. Personalization.
Yes, personalization. This is about where you assign the fault. Is the cause internal, pointing at yourself, or is it external, pointing at the environment?
So when the presentation fails, the classic pessimist personalizes it entirely. They say, it's all my fault, I'm just stupid, I don't have what it takes to be a leader.
Right. They take the full, crushing weight of the failure onto their own ego.
Okay, wait, I have to push back here, because this is where the self-help version of this always loses me.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, I mean, if an optimist always blames external circumstances for their failures, like the projector broke, the audience was tired, the client was in a bad mood, the room was too hot, aren't they just actively avoiding accountability?
It's a fair question.
Right. Nobody likes a person who never says my bad. If you constantly externalize everything that goes wrong, you aren't an optimist. You're a narcissist who never learns from your mistakes.
Right. You're hitting on the core paradox of this dimension, and it is a vital nuance in the research that pop psychology usually just ignores. You are absolutely right.
Okay, phew.
The relationship between personalization and psychological health is incredibly complex. The goal of this research is not to prescribe blind, unhinged optimism where nothing is ever your fault.
Because that kind of extreme externalization is deeply toxic.
Exactly. It leads to precisely what you just described, a failure to take responsibility for genuinely controllable outcomes. And you become antisocial, alienating everyone around you because you refuse to own your mistakes.
So if extreme internalizing causes depression and extreme externalizing makes you a toxic narcissist, what is the actual ideal balance we're looking for?
The scientific term for the optimal position is calibrated attribution.
Calibrated attribution. I like that.
It's not about positive thinking. It's about stark, objective accuracy. Excessive self-blame, taking responsibility for things you literally could not control, is highly associated with depression because it creates unnecessary helplessness.
But avoiding responsibility destroys growth.
Right. Calibrated attribution means taking total, unvarnished ownership for what was actually within your control while accurately attributing what was not in your control to external factors.
So the healthy response is, I should have rehearsed the financial slides more, and I didn't anticipate their questions. That is entirely on me.
Yes.
But the projector breaking and the client arriving 20 minutes late and stressed out, that was external.
That is the perfect way to frame it. So it's not about forcing yourself to wear rose-colored glasses. It's about wearing a perfectly prescribed set of corrective lenses.
You just want to see reality clearly without the distortion of either extreme ego or extreme self-loathing.
Exactly. And just to complete the picture of these three dimensions, it's worth noting that for good events, the explanatory styles are completely inverted.
Which is fascinating because we rarely think about how we explain our successes to ourselves.
We really don't. But when a classic pessimist gets a massive promotion, their explanatory style actively sabotages the victory.
Oh, so.
They explain it as temporary, like they just needed someone right now, it won't last.
Oh, wow.
And they explain it as specific. I only got it because I was the only one available in this one tiny department. And external. The boss was just in a good mood or they felt sorry for me.
So they completely rob themselves of the joy and the psychological reinforcement of the achievement.
They really do.
And by robbing themselves of that joy, they fail to release the dopamine that reinforces positive behavior.
Right. But when an optimist gets a promotion, they view it as permanent. Like, I am a talented, capable person.
And pervasive. I bring value to everything I do, not just this role.
Exactly. And internal, I earn this through my hard work and intelligence. They allow the success to become part of their core identity.
That makes so much sense. And understanding these three dimensions, permanence, pervasiveness, and personalization, explains exactly how a pessimistic worldview literally paves the road to clinical depression.
It does.
So if I'm tracking this correctly, if someone walks around with a pessimistic explanatory style, meaning every time they hit a speed bump, they tell themselves it's permanent, it ruins everything, and it's all their fault, they are basically setting up the dominoes for depression.
Yes, they are.
But how does that chain reaction actually play out in the real world?
It is a very mechanical chain reaction, and the longitudinal studies on this are incredibly robust. If you take a large group of psychologically healthy individuals and just measure their baseline explanatory style, you can predict with startling accuracy who is vulnerable to depression in the future.
Wow.
Yeah. A pessimistic explanatory style, when combined with a negative life event, is highly predictive of depression onset. It's actually more predictive than just the severity of the negative event alone.
That's wild. So it's not what happens to you. It's the specific vocabulary you use to process what happens to you.
Exactly. It starts with that expectation of uncontrollability. Remember the dogs in the harness. The pessimistic style creates the overarching belief that whatever I do won't matter.
Right.
This cognitive state immediately produces motivational deficits. You literally stop trying. You fail to take action in situations where your action would actually be highly effective.
Because why bother studying for the next test if you've already decided you're fundamentally stupid? Why bother applying for another job if you've decided you're permanently unemployable?
Precisely. And because you don't take action because you don't study or you don't prep for the interview, you experience real-world performance failures. You fail the next test. You bomb the next interview.
And what does that objective failure do?
It serves as false evidence that confirms your original pessimistic expectation. The brain says, see, I told you we were stupid.
Yeah.
It consolidates the pessimistic style. It becomes a vicious, self-sealing loop of self-fulfilling prophecies.
And if you look at the history of psychology, this maps perfectly onto some of the most famous frameworks for treating depression, right? It bridges the gap between experimental research and actual therapy.
It absolutely does. Aaron Beck, who is universally considered one of the giants of modern psychiatry, identified what he called the depressive cognitive triad.
The depressive cognitive triad.
Yes. Through his clinical observations, he noted that depressed individuals have rigidly negative, distorted views of three specific things: themselves, the world, and the future.
And if you look closely at the architecture, this maps flawlessly onto Seligman's three dimensions. Let's unpack that matching because it's so elegant.
Let's do it.
A negative view of the self is personalization. The belief that, it's all my fault, I'm inherently flawed.
Right.
A negative view of the world is pervasiveness. The belief that everything is terrible everywhere, nothing works, the whole system is rigged.
Yes.
And a negative view of the future is permanence. The belief that it will always be this bad, tomorrow will be just as hopeless as today.
The explanatory style model provided the mechanical, empirical gears behind Beck's clinical observations. And understanding these gears led to the development of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
Right.
Today, CBT is the most evidence-based, widely practiced psychological treatment for depression and anxiety in the world. And its primary mechanism is the cognitive restructuring of these maladaptive attributions.
So if someone goes to a CBT therapist, they aren't going to, light incense, hand them a crystal, and tell them to chant about how wonderful they are.
No, not at all. CBT is the opposite of uncritical happyology. The core principle of CBT is rigorous accuracy.
I love that. Rigorous accuracy.
It's about teaching you to become a ruthless scientist of your own mind. The therapist helps you identify the moments when you are taking a negative event and falsely attributing it to permanent, global, and internal causes. They help you put your own thoughts on the witness stand and look at the actual evidence.
It's like debugging code in a software program.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking for this specific line of faulty logic, the always or the never, that's causing the whole emotional system to crash.
That's exactly what it is. If you failed a math test, does the empirical evidence really support the conclusion that you are universally stupid and will fail at life?
Yeah.
No. When you examine the evidence, it supports a temporary, specific attribution. You didn't study the right formulas for this specific test because you misread the syllabus.
Right.
CBT corrects the math of your mind. It teaches you to rewrite the code so the system runs smoothly again.
Okay, so we've established that explanatory style dictates our mental health and our vulnerability to depression. And honestly, that makes intuitive sense to most people. The mind obviously affects the mind.
Sure.
But here's where this research takes a hard left turn into the physical world.
This is my favorite part.
How on earth does your internal monologue, whether you use words like always or sometimes bleed over into your physical biology, your immune system, and your actual measurable longevity.
It sounds crazy, right?
Because the data on this is staggering, and it feels almost like magic until you understand the biology.
It is one of the most robust, heavily replicated, and surprising findings in all of health psychology. Studies across multiple populations, spanning decades, have found that optimism predicts longevity, cardiovascular health, immune function, and recovery speed from major illness.
But measuring this in a lab only tells us about short-term stress.
Right.
If this theory is true, we should be able to see it play out over a human lifetime. But you can't lock someone in a lab for 80 years to see if their optimism keeps them alive. So how do you actually prove it?
It's tricky.
We have to talk about Christopher Peterson's baseball study, because this is just such a wildly creative, ingenious way to do science.
It is brilliant. Christopher Peterson and his colleagues wanted to see if explanatory style predicted lifespan. But as you said, they couldn't wait 60 years to do a prospective study, so they looked backwards.
Okay, how did they do that?
They took Hall of Fame baseball players from the first half of the 20th century, men who played in the 1920s and 30s. They dug up old newspaper interviews from when these players were young, active, healthy athletes. And they used a technique called KV content analysis of verbatim explanations. They retrospectively coded the language in these interviews for optimism versus pessimism. They looked at how the players explained their setbacks to the press: a slump at the plate, a lost game, a twisted ankle.
So they were basically hunting for the 3 Ps in the newspaper quotes.
Exactly.
If a player struck out 3 times in a game, did they say, "I'm just a terrible hitter, I've lost my swing completely," which is permanent, pervasive, personal?
Right.
Or did they say, "The pitcher had a devastating curveball today, and the shadows on the field made it hard to track, temporary, specific, external"?
Exactly. They rigorously quantified the explanatory style of these athletes based purely on their language when they were in their 20s, and then they looked at their death records decades later.
Wow. And what did they find?
The results were stark and undeniable. A pessimistic explanatory style in early life significantly predicted an earlier death. The players who habitually explained setbacks as permanent and pervasive literally died younger.
That is wild. But if I'm listening to this, and I'm a skeptical, data-minded person, my immediate thought is, correlation doesn't equal causation.
Sure.
How do we know the optimists weren't just healthier to begin with? Like, if I have great genetics, a naturally strong heart, and a robust immune system, I'm probably going to be more optimistic in interviews because my body feels good.
That's a very valid point.
Did the optimism cause the health, or did the baseline health cause the optimism?
That is the crucial question, and it's the exact reason why these specific longitudinal studies are so highly regarded in the scientific community. They didn't just look at raw correlation. They used complex regression analysis to rigorously control for baseline health.
Okay, give me an example of that.
Let's look at another famous example, the Harvard study of adult development, which tracked men over their entire adult lives. Researchers looked at how these men, when they were young adults returning from World War II, explained their difficult wartime experiences. Those who used a pessimistic explanatory style for their wartime trauma had significantly worse physical health decades later, at ages 45 and 60.
But they knew the health of these men when they returned, right?
Yes. They had comprehensive medical records from when these men were in their 20s. They factored that baseline physical health into the statistical models.
So they controlled for it.
Exactly. They also controlled for the objective difficulty of the wartime experiences. They made sure they weren't just comparing someone who had a relatively safe desk job in London with someone who saw heavy, traumatizing frontline combat in the Pacific.
Right, that would skew everything.
Right. Even when you completely level the playing field, accounting for baseline health, genetics, and the objective severity of the trauma, the explanatory style preceded and independently predicted the health outcomes decades later.
Wow.
The causal arrow points definitively from the mind to the body.
So if the mind is driving the body, what is the actual physical bridge? Walk me through the biological pipeline. How does a thought about a failed presentation or a lost baseball game turn into a weaker immune system 20 years later?
It's all about stress.
So if I'm internalizing this, the brain must be treating a psychological setback the exact same way it treats a physical threat.
Yeah.
Right? It's triggering a biological cascade because it thinks I'm under actual physical attack.
That is the fundamental mechanism. The biological pipeline is incredibly concrete. It comes down to chronic stress regulation. People with a pessimistic explanatory style perceive more events as uncontrollable, permanent threats.
Right.
When you perceive an uncontrollable threat, your amygdala, the brain's fear center, sounds the alarm. This activates the body's primary stress response system, the HPA axis. That stands for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
And the adrenal glands are the ones pumping out cortisol, right? The fight or flight hormone.
Yes. In short, acute bursts, cortisol is magnificent. It's necessary for survival.
Like if you're running from a tiger.
Exactly. If you are running from a predator, cortisol floods your system, spikes your blood sugar for immediate energy, and shuts down non-essential functions like digestion and the immune system, so all resources go to your muscles.
But chronic pessimistic processing means you are constantly telling your brain that you are under threat, which means chronic cortisol elevation.
Right.
And what happens when cortisol never turns off?
It creates widespread physiological damage. Cortisol literally tells your white blood cells, your lymphocytes, to stop responding to threats.
Wait, really?
Yes. It's an evolutionary mechanism to prioritize immediate survival over fighting off a cold. But when it's constantly active because you're pessimistic about a spreadsheet or a traffic jam, your body is effectively turning off its own defenses.
So it's fighting a tiger that isn't there
Yeah.
and ignoring the actual virus that is.
Exactly. Over time, this produces systemic inflammation, which is the root cause of almost every chronic disease, from cardiovascular disease to autoimmune disorders, and it severely suppresses your immune function, making you more susceptible to infections and slower to heal. Optimists, because they don't catastrophize setbacks into permanent global threats, have lower, healthier cortisol responses. Their HPA axis is better regulated. Their immune systems are robust because they aren't constantly suppressed by stress hormones.
So there's this profound cellular regulation happening. But there's also a behavioral component to longevity, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just magic cellular biology. It changes what you actually do with your physical body.
Oh, absolutely. The behavioral pathway is just as important. Optimists engage in vastly better health behaviors.
Right?
If you believe your actions matter, which is the absolute core of the optimistic explanatory style, you are more likely to actually go to the doctor when you feel a weird lump. You are more likely to adhere to a difficult diet or a complex medication regimen.
Because you think it'll actually work.
Exactly. A pessimist feels the lump and thinks, I'm doomed anyway, it's permanent, what's the point of going through chemo?
That's so sad.
The optimist thinks, this is a specific temporary hurdle and this treatment protocol will help me beat it. So the optimism drives the actual physical behavior that saves their life.
It all comes back to the unplugged controller. The pessimist doesn't take the medicine because they think the buttons don't work anyway.
Right.
Okay, so if optimism is this incredible elixir for longevity, immune function, mental health, and medication adherence, this raises a massive evolutionary question.
I know where you're going with this too.
Why does pessimism still exist? I mean, if optimists live longer, reproduce more, and are healthier, shouldn't pessimism have been bred out of the human gene pool millennia ago? Is pessimism just a biological glitch?
It is definitely not a glitch. And to understand why pessimism survived the evolutionary filter, we have to look at one of the most intellectually important challenges to uncritical optimism. It's a concept called depressive realism, which was heavily researched by psychologists Lynn Abramson and Lauren Alloy.
So what did they do to challenge the pro-optimism narrative?
They brought people into a laboratory and gave them cognitive tasks where the outcomes were genuinely random, or where the participants only had very weak, negligible control over the results.
Okay.
Think of sitting at a desk and pushing a button that only occasionally makes a light bulb turn on, but the light is actually on a randomized timer completely independent of your pushing.
So you have literally no control.
None.
Yeah.
Afterwards, they asked the participants a simple question. How much control did you have over the light?
And let me guess, the optimists and pessimists answered very differently.
Drastically differently. The mildly depressed individuals, the pessimists, were incredibly accurate. They correctly assessed the reality of the situation, that they had almost zero control over the light.
Huh.
But the non-depressed individuals, the optimists, significantly overestimated their control. They fell victim to what is called the illusion of control. They thought their button pushing was causing the light to turn on.
So in this scenario, the optimists were basically delusional. Their perception of reality was fundamentally flawed.
In these specific laboratory conditions, yes. The optimists' confidence wasn't based on an accurate perception of physics. It was a systematic cognitive bias. They believed they were in the driver's seat when they were actually in the passenger seat. The pessimists saw reality for exactly what it was.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the cognitive neuroscientist Tali Sharot has written extensively about this in her work on the optimism bias. She argues that this delusion, this positive illusion of control, isn't a flaw. It is actually a species-wide evolutionary adaptation.
Exactly.
Think about it. Imagine an early human, tens of thousands of years ago, sitting in a cave trying to do the math on hunting a mammoth.
Right.
If they accurately assessed the terrible objective odds of survival, the sheer size of the mammoths, the fragility of their stone spears, the high likelihood of being crushed or freezing to death, they would never leave the cave.
They wouldn't.
They would literally sit there in perfectly accurate objective reality and starve to death. We actually needed this delusion, this optimism bias, to motivate action in highly uncertain, dangerous environments.
That mammoth analogy captures the evolutionary necessity perfectly. The positive illusion motivates persistence. An organism that accurately perceives the high probability of failure in hunting or courtship or competing for resources might not attempt the action at all. It's too risky.
Right.
But if you have a slight cognitive bias that whispers, you have a better chance than average, your spear is sharper, you are faster, you take the shot, and sometimes, against the odds, you bring down the mammoth. You survive and you pass on those optimistic genes.
But Abramson and Alloy's lab tests were entirely artificial. The button literally didn't control the light. Real life isn't a randomized light bulb.
And that is the crucial qualification that puts depressive realism in context. In a rigged laboratory where outcomes are mathematically random, the pessimist is more accurate. But in the real world, outside the lab, outcomes are almost never completely random.
No.
In the real world, effort, persistence, and resilience usually do change the outcome. So the optimist's positive illusion becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because they overestimate their chances of success, they try harder, they persist longer, they make one more sales call, they run one more mile.
And therefore, they actually create the success that the pessimist misses out on by giving up too early.
Exactly.
So the optimism bias isn't a bug, it's a feature. It drives the necessary action to succeed in a world where effort matters.
Right.
But this brings us to a huge dilemma for a lot of people listening. What if you aren't naturally wired that way? What if you are naturally anxious, natural pessimistic, and your brain defaults to seeing the risks? Are you just doomed to a shorter life, a weaker immune system, and less success?
Absolutely not. Enter a highly sophisticated psychological loophole.
I love a psychological loophole.
This is where the research gets incredibly empowering for people who struggle with anxiety. This is the concept of defensive pessimism, identified by researchers Julie Norham and Nancy Cantor in the late 1980s.
Okay, defensive pessimism.
Yeah. And it completely disrupts the one-size-fits-all idea that everyone should just force themselves to be sunny optimists.
I love this concept because I know so many people who operate exactly like this and they are incredibly successful. Tell us how a defensive pessimist operates.
A defensive pessimist uses the deliberate, intentional anticipation of negative outcomes as a cognitive tool. Before a challenging performance, a high-stakes job interview, a public speech, or a big international trip, they intentionally imagine all the specific ways things might go wrong. They vividly picture the disasters.
Which sounds completely miserable to an optimist. Why would anyone voluntarily torture themselves like that?
Because of what they do with the anxiety it generates. A genuine depressed pessimist imagines failure, decides the situation is permanent and uncontrollable, and becomes passive. They disengage.
Yeah.
But a defensive pessimist uses the anxiety as high-octane fuel for active preparation.
Okay, we all know this person. They are the chronic overpacker.
Oh, yeah.
They are packing for a weekend trip to Florida, and their internal monologue is catastrophizing at level 10. The airline will definitely lose my luggage. It will rain the entire time. The hotel room will have terrible AC. I won't sleep, and I will catch a cold.
Yep, that's them.
It sounds like they are absolute torture to travel with. But because of that intense anxiety, they pack a heavy raincoat, 3 days of spare clothes in their carry-on, and a full pharmacy of medicine.
Exactly.
And when it inevitably pours rain and their checked bag ends up in Seattle, they're completely fine. They survive and thrive because they catastrophized.
That is the exact psychological mechanism at play. They channel the anxiety generated by negative anticipation into meticulous, actionable preparation. And functionally, this produces behavior that leads to highly successful performance.
No.
They achieve the exact same performance benefits as the optimist, but they travel a completely different psychological route to get there. The optimist succeeds through confidence. The defensive pessimist succeeds through hyper-preparedness.
Wait, I'm struggling with the biology of this. We just established that chronic pessimism spikes cortisol, suppresses lymphocytes, and ruins your health. If the defensive pessimist is constantly catastrophizing about lost luggage and failed interviews, isn't that spiking their cortisol too?
That's a great question.
Why doesn't the overpacker suffer the same immune system damage as the depressed pessimist?
That is a brilliant distinction to make. The difference lies in the nature of the anxiety. Active versus passive.
Okay, unpack that for me.
The depressed pessimist experiences passive anxiety, the belief that the threat is coming and they are helpless to stop it. That helpless state is what chronically dysregulates the HPA axis.
Right.
But the defensive pessimist experiences active anxiety. The moment they pack the raincoat or rehearse the interview questions, they are asserting control. The action of preparation resolves the biological stress loop.
Oh, that's fascinating.
They use the cortisol spike to solve the problem, which then allows their nervous system to return to baseline. They aren't helpless. They are highly mobilized.
That makes total sense. They are using the stress response for its evolutionary purpose, to prepare for a threat. Here is the craziest part of Norm's research, though. What happens if you take a defensive pessimist and force them to think positively?
Oh, it's
Like you tell the anxious overpacker, hey, stop worrying, visualize a sunny beach, the airline never loses bags, just manifest a perfect, frictionless trip.
Their performance plummets. It actually heavily impairs their ability to succeed. If you force a defensive pessimist to think positively or relax, you disrupt their anxiety preparation cycle.
Wow.
You rob them of the cognitive fuel they used to prepare. Because they aren't allowed to catastrophize, they don't pack the raincoat, they don't rehearse the hard interview questions, and they go into the situation underprepared, highly vulnerable, and ultimately they fail.
That directly refutes the entire self-help industry's blanket advice to just think positive.
It completely dismantles it. The broader implication here is that cognitive strategies are profoundly person-specific. What works perfectly for one nervous system might completely crash another. The optimist's explanatory style and the defensive pessimist's anticipatory strategy are both highly adaptive for the people who naturally use them. The goal of applied psychology isn't to take a defensive pessimist and force them to smile, suppress their anxiety, and ignore risks.
The goal is to help individuals optimize their natural cognitive wiring so they can perform at their best.
Exactly.
So we've established how these mindsets work in controlled laboratory settings. We've seen how they play out over decades in baseball players and WWII veterans, and we understand the daily active anxiety loop of the overpacker.
Right.
But how do these mindsets hold up under the most extreme, brutal conditions imaginable? When survival isn't about an immune system boost or acing a job interview, but about enduring unimaginable daily physical and psychological trauma.
To answer that, we have to look at one of the most profound case studies in human resilience, the story of Admiral James Stockdale.
Yeah, this is a heavy one.
It is. From 1965 to 1973, Stockdale was the highest-ranking American naval officer held as a prisoner of war in the infamous Hanoi Hilton during the Vietnam War. He survived 8 years of brutal captivity, routine torture, and extensive solitary confinement without any prisoner's rights or knowledge of when or if he would ever be released.
And years later, the author Jim Collins, who writes about organizational leadership in business, was interviewing Stockdale for his seminal book, Good to Great.
Right.
Collins asked Stockdale a fundamental question about the psychology of the prison camp. Who didn't make it out? And Stockdale's answer was incredibly counterintuitive.
It was chilling in its directness. Stockdale said, without hesitation, oh, that's easy, the optimist.
The optimist.
Yeah.
But everything we've talked about for the last 40 minutes, the baseball players, the immune systems of mammoth hunters, says optimists survive.
Stockdale elaborated, and in doing so, he defined the absolute limit of uncalibrated optimism. He said the optimists were the ones who would say, we're going to be out by Christmas. And Christmas would come and Christmas would go. Then they'd recalibrate and say, we're going to be out by Easter. And Easter would come and Easter would go. And then Thanksgiving. And then it would be Christmas again.
That is brutal.
Stockdale observed that these pure optimists essentially died of a broken heart. The repeated, crushing failure to meet those specific, highly optimistic targets destroyed their psychological capacity to endure.
They kept plugging the controller back in, expecting it to work on a specific timeline. And when it didn't, the profound disappointment literally killed them.
Exactly. The gap between their optimistic expectation and the brutal reality became lethal. So Collins asked him, then how did you survive?
Yeah, how did he?
And Stockdale articulated what Collins later named the Stockdale paradox. It is the simultaneous maintenance of two cognitive states that seem, on the surface, entirely contradictory.
Okay, what are they?
Stockdale said, you must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be.
Ultimate faith in the overarching narrative, combined with brutal, unflinching realism about the present moment.
Yes. And if we map this back to everything we've discussed about learned optimism and explanatory style, the Stockdale paradox is not a rejection of optimism. It is the ultimate masterclass example of applying it correctly.
Wow.
The destructive optimism in the POW camp was the setting of arbitrary short-term targets that ignored the brutal reality of their captors' control. It was an inaccurate assessment of their environment.
It was delusion, not optimism.
Precisely. The adaptive optimism Stockdale strategy was maintaining the fundamental belief in future capability and worth. That's the permanent, pervasive optimism. I will survive this, and this experience will define my life, not end it.
Right.
But he combined that overarching optimism with an incredibly accurate, unvarnished assessment of his current daily conditions. He didn't sugarcoat the torture. He didn't pretend the guards were going to be nice tomorrow. He faced the ugly truth daily, adapting to it, organizing the other prisoners to communicate without ever losing the overarching war for his mind.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this right now? It means that toxic optimism, the kind that ignores reality, suppresses negative thoughts, and demands you just manifest a good outcome without acknowledging the struggle is dangerous.
It really is.
It makes you deeply fragile when reality inevitably hits you. Adaptive optimism, the kind that creates true biological and psychological resilience, looks the brutal facts of your life dead in the eye and says, this is incredibly hard, the odds are bad, I am in pain, but I still believe I have the capacity to navigate it and prevail in the end.
It's the stark difference between saying everything is fine when the house is literally on fire versus saying the house is on fire, the flames are spreading fast, we need to grab the fire extinguisher immediately, but I fundamentally believe we are capable of putting it out.
One mindset burns to death while smiling, and the other survives. So we've decoded the science of the dogs in the shuttle box, the cellular biology of the HPA axis, the evolutionary loopholes of mammoth hunters and overpackers, and the extreme stress tests of the Hanoi Hilton.
We've covered a lot.
The final practical question is, how do we actually install this upgraded mental software in our own brains? If you're listening to this and rolling your eyes, because this sounds like just another flavor of think positive, I get it. But if I have a naturally pessimistic explanatory style, am I just stuck with it?
You are absolutely not stuck. And we know this definitively thanks to extensive clinical programs like the Penn Resiliency Program, which grew directly out of Martin Seligman's positive psychology work at the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay, the Penn Resiliency Program.
This program has proven across multiple large-scale randomized trials that an optimistic explanatory style can actually be taught, practiced, and internalized by both children and adults.
But again, to address the skepticism, this isn't what Seligman calls happyology, right? We aren't asking people to stand in front of a mirror repeating affirmations about being wealthy and successful.
No, Seligman is very critical of uncritical happyology. The Penn Resiliency Program is essentially rigorous cognitive accuracy training.
Rigorous cognitive accuracy training.
It teaches you to treat your own thoughts as hypotheses rather than unquestionable facts. The difference here is that we are asking you to be a ruthless lawyer, cross-examining your own thoughts, not a cheerleader hyping yourself up.
How does that work in actual daily practice?
It involves catching your automatic pessimistic thoughts in the moment they occur. When a negative event happens, what is your immediate internal explanation? You have to catch that thought, put it on trial, and evaluate the evidence.
Right.
If the evidence does not support a permanent, pervasive, and personal attribution, you actively generate alternative attributions that are more scientifically accurate.
So you're literally using the vocabulary we talked about earlier, permanence, pervasiveness, personalization, as an analytical tool for daily self-examination.
Exactly. I would challenge everyone listening to try this today. Pay close attention to your internal monologue. When you drop your coffee, or you miss a deadline, or someone cuts you off in traffic, actively listen to the exact words you use to explain it to yourself.
Look for those absolutist words.
Yes. Look for words like always, never, everything, or ruined.
The classic, I always mess things up, everything is going wrong today, my day's ruined.
Yes. When you hear those words in your head, that is your immediate cue to aggressively check them against the evidence. Did you always mess things up? Let's look at the data.
Right.
No, you successfully completed 3 complex projects yesterday and navigated a difficult conversation perfectly. Is everything going wrong? No, you're healthy, your car works. It's just this one specific email chain that is frustrating.
You consciously, deliberately revise the attribution
Yeah.
to make it temporary, specific, and external where appropriate.
It is cognitively demanding work. It is tiring at first, but it is a highly practical, valuable skill that literally, over time, reshapes the neural pathways of how your brain processes reality.
Okay, let's zoom out and look at the massive journey we've been on today, because this all ties together in a profoundly cohesive way.
It really does.
We started with the foundational virus, learned helplessness. We saw how shocked dogs gave up because they learned in abstraction that their actions didn't matter. We mapped out the 3D architecture of our excuses, how we use permanence, pervasiveness, and personalization to build the psychological reality we live in.
Yeah.
We saw how this explanatory style isn't just floating in the ether. It literally alters our cellular biology, dictating our HPA axis, our cortisol levels, and our immune response.
Which is still just amazing to me.
We discovered that the optimism bias isn't just a mood, but an evolutionary survival tool that motivated us to leave the cave. But we also learned that even chronic anxiety can be weaponized for success through defensive pessimism, provided you use it for active preparation rather than passive despair. And finally, we looked at the Hanoi Hilton to understand that the ultimate form of resilience is the Stockdale paradox, pairing an unshakable faith in the future with the brutal, unvarnished honesty of the present.
When you braid all those threads together, the helplessness, the biology, the nuanced application of realism, it represents a profound shift in how we understand human thriving. True optimism isn't about ignoring the bad. It's about accurately processing the bad, so it doesn't biologically or psychologically paralyze you.
Which brings me to a final, completely unexplored question that I want to leave you with, based on everything we've unpacked today about how the mind learns to be helpless.
Okay, what is it?
If our explanatory style is shaped by how we process failure and uncontrollability in our environment, what happens when we look at our modern, highly curated digital landscape?
Oh, wow.
If you are constantly doom-scrolling through a feed of global tragedies, economic crises, and political outrage that feel utterly inescapable, permanent, and pervasive, are we accidentally mass-producing learned helplessness on a societal scale?
That is a terrifying thought.
Are we plugging ourselves into a digital version of Seligman's shockbox, where we have absolutely no control over the events we are witnessing? Next time you look at a screen and feel a profound, paralyzing sense of doom, pause and ask yourself, is the world actually ending? Or is your algorithm just teaching you to be helpless?